Later, back with our second program with the producer of Saturday Night Live, Lorne Michaels. It's fair to say that everybody who became famous through Saturday Night Live became a comedian in a sort of rock and roll sense, a rock and roll comic star. Gilda was.
Yeah.
Bill Murray. So even Steve Martin, who had made many appearances on The Tonight Show, didn't create that concert kind of frenzy until Saturday Night Live.
Well, rock and roll, for lack of a better phrase, was the dominant sensibility of that time. It was what people listened to, and it was what the show, just as The Tonight Show had, in a sense, been formed musically in the big band era, Saturday night, when Howard Shore was designing the band for the show in '75, what we kept going back to was sort of Junior Walker and that sound, which was the sound that it had an influence on us. So we wanted that kind of utility rather than sounding like playing La Vie en Rose underneath a sketch every time we were in a restaurant, although I'm sure we did that as well.
So all of the biggest stars were able to create a style and a feel about their work that was different than the comedic sensibilities of even 5 or 10 years before, let alone 2 decades prior. So as I name each of these performers, give me your best sense of what it was about them that allowed them to elevate to that level.
Okay.
Gilda.
Gilda, it always seemed to me that it was about heart and the ability to sort of take a punch. You know, Gilda had this, Gilda was incredibly physical. She'd been very athletic as a girl, and she could, you know, bang into walls better than anyone who was ever on the show. And so there was something you just liked about her because she was going to win you over. She was going to get your heart, and she was just unstoppable.
You mentioned Gilda's physical dexterity, but obviously the one most famous for that was Chevy Chase with all the pratfalls. How did it start? Before
the show went on the air, he would fall all the time and fall around the office, and would fall in a restaurant to make you laugh, particularly in dangerous restaurants where people falling could actually get you into trouble, falling across other people. When he became famous and would do it, because he so wanted to make you laugh, he so was that was what made him happy. It was a sort of amateur thing, and when he became professional, and he did it, people would say, well, how can he be doing that? You know, how pathetic that he needs to get that kind of attention in public, whereas that's what he used to do. That's what had drawn him to our attention. That's what made him who he was.
In the first year, he was the guy who emerged as a star.
Without question.
The others were appreciated by comedy connoisseurs, but the general public knew Chevy Chase. He was the identity of the show.
He was the most accessible. He was the one who was the most similar to what had gone before. So that him behind a desk, the cover of Jeff Greenfield did a piece for New York Magazine in which the cover was the next Johnny Carson. Chevy couldn't have been farther from the next Johnny Carson, but it was an easy way to define what at that point defied definition. So they made him what already was.
How badly did it hurt you, personally, that he left after the first year? Everybody's got to go eventually.
Year and a half. He was actually there for the first year and a half, but he did 40 shows. I think that, yeah, I think it was an enormous blow because he and I it's hard to sort of recapture this, but when you're that young, or at least when I was that young, people 5 or 6 years younger than you were like completely different generation, and you didn't hang with them in the same way that you did with people your own age. Chevy is 6 years older than I am. No, Chevy is about my age. He's a year older than I am. Did it hurt me? Just to avoid the question even longer, yeah, it hurt me. Yeah, at the time because I didn't know not to take everything personally. I hadn't grown up in the job yet.
When he came back, I guess, to guest host,
yeah,
the story has it that he and Bill Murray duked it out.
Yep, that happened. And you want me to elaborate
over what?
On that?
Yes, elaboration would be much appreciated here. Your sense of this is uncanny.
Right, yeah. Well, this is not my first time in late night. There was a perception. I had stayed in touch with Chevy. There was, as I mentioned before, there was a tremendous resentment from John at Chevy's success. And although Chevy came back in with his emotion about the show had become fossilized. It was he was coming back into what he thought of as a home, and it's like going back to your high school, or worse, going back to your public school and realizing how low the drinking fountains are when you're older. You know, there's something about the group that he was coming back to.
An emotion, by the way, that's never seized me, but that's a different topic.
Well, the thing that happened with Chevy was what he was coming back to wasn't the same group. They'd grown, they were much tougher, much more experienced, more solid. Billy had come in, and the fight between Billy and Chevy, of which a lot has been written about, and it did actually get to blows, right in the middle of it was John. John, who was shuttling between the two at the time, and who I must say, in a sort of pixie-like way, had managed to provoke the fight. I was upstairs giving notes between dress and air, tech notes, and it was, I think it happened, about 10 minutes before we went on, throwing Chevy completely in his monologue, which I think was the intent of it. I think it was much more in an athletic metaphor to throw him off his game than it was meant as the long, festering scar that it probably has left. Because I think that it was mean and it was cheap. And of course, belonged completely to the times we were living in and the group that we were a part of at that time.
So these guys go at it.
Yeah.
Obviously, neither one was seriously damaged in the fist fight.
Right.
But how badly was the show damaged because of it? Because they had to be rattled, right?
It was very bad because it tore at the fabric of the show, because what was happening then was the beginning of the sense that Danny and John were going to leave. John probably would never have left. John had to leave because career swept him along and there was no choice. But John's heart never left the show. He always haunted it. He never stopped talking about it. It was, for all of us, it was our first, not only our first success, it was something that was, that we would never, to this day, as you can tell how inarticulate I am about the emotional part of it, it was something where we were all so, not only living on top of each other, we were just, there was just this incredible sense of elation when you would watch the rest of the cast watching somebody else out there working and somebody just taking off and soaring, Danny doing something that was remarkable, Lorraine being incredibly funny, and then suddenly everybody standing by the side of the stage off camera just bursting into applause with the audience or laughing or wanting it so much to succeed. We were all of a piece. We all wanted it. So it was all for one, one for all, and then suddenly it wasn't. And ambition and all of that had, you know, and everybody had their opinion about it, but we hadn't had to deal with it. Now we had to deal with Billy, and the press was beating us up about the fact that Chevy wasn't there, and nobody was saying, and that put too much pressure on Billy, which we were trying to shield. And one of the things that we did was Billy wrote a piece in which he talked directly into the lens, talking about it, and that was very successful in diffusing the criticism.
You see,
that was the one where he said, look, I'm just trying to make my way. I'm a humble guy. Please send me your letter of support. And then he closed it by saying, there have been so many problems or something like that, including the father I never knew. I mean, the most maudlin and transparent plea.
Yes. In a certain way, what Chevy's leaving did was it defined Saturday Night Live as the show that it now is. John and Gilda emerged in that second season to become stars in their own right. In the third season, Billy began to emerge. Jane, Lorraine, Garrett, everybody knew everybody by the end of the third season. And in the fourth season, at the end of it, Bill Murray was the biggest star on the show.
Lorraine Newman, Jane Curtin, Garrett Morris, they all had their moments, but it's safe to say they didn't have as many defining characters associated with them. I mean, Garrett had Chico Escuela, and Lorraine had several Valley Girl types, and Jane had the point-counterpoint with Aykroyd, and they were all very good, but they weren't as strong on an ongoing basis as the others were.
No.
Was that a sore point for them, or were they able to accept the role players'
I think everybody dealt with everything. In a certain way, there was too much to distract us to focus on that, in the sense that Jane and Lorraine were in the Coneheads. If you were in the Coneheads, it took 15 minutes to get into the makeup. There was always something to do. Jane would be doing update. There was always... Jane had 1,000 thankless roles, and in many ways was the sort of female counterpart to Danny.
The rock and roll sensibility of Saturday Night Live, which now is a given, but then was a radical departure for network television, which is different than the Beatles being on Ed Sullivan, because when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, the adults were saying, look at these nice moppets that the kids are so crazy for.
Yeah.
Now the kids were running the store. And you were able to get Simon and Garfunkel to reunite, and George Harrison came on with Paul Simon one time, and you got the Rolling Stones. But your most noble effort, even though it was a failure, the nobility of it stands, was the attempt to get the Beatles back together.
The way that came about was somebody offered $50 million to the Beatles to reunite. And we thought, and there was talk that they were considering it, and it was in New York. The story came out of New York. So we decided that I would go on the air and offer what we were allowed to offer. And we checked with what we were allowed to offer with the network at the time, and it was $3,500. So I think it was actually $3,250 was the first offer, and then later we bumped it up to $3,500, and which was essentially scale for 4 guys. And the story's been told lots of times. Paul McCartney has told me his version of it, and John Lennon, I only read his version of it in the Playboy interview, where, according to, depending upon whose version you want to believe, they were together in the Dakota and watched it as it was happening, and either one or the other said, let's do it, and the other said, oh, all right, and then maybe we shouldn't. And the one thing we knew for sure, though, was that they'd never get past security here.
We talked a lot about the show in the past. Let's fast forward now to the present, and it's obvious that there are many funny and talented people on the show and many great individual moments. But would you agree that it's not an event like it used to be? I mean, there was a time when you absolutely had to see Saturday Night Live.
For people your age, yes. You know, or for, and I would include that, you know, it's still the #1 rated show in late-night television. There are nights when I phone in, or days when I check on the ratings when we're rated, higher rated than most of the primetime schedule on some of the other networks. I think that the core audience for the show, there are things that we do, and there are shows in last season, and I don't want to mention names, but that I think are better work than we ever did before. You can't ever get the excitement of newness. You can't ever be new again. You can just uphold a tradition, and I think that something about the 15th anniversary show, for us, sort of validated that, in the sense that, I mean, you can't be more ready for prime time than coming in the top 10 on a Sunday night at 9 o'clock. I mean, we were in the top 10 in prime time on a Sunday night at 9, and what was so shocking to me was all of those fights in the 70s and for a big chunk of the 80s, over content, all of it sailed through. There was no letters. The context had changed. We were now Saturday Night Live. We're safer now, or it's safer to like us. We're not, they don't know in the same way. Every week there's always something that gets somebody upset, but that's our tradition. It's explainable now.
Plus, the contrast isn't as great to other things that surround it on television, whether it's network television or cable TV. It doesn't stand alone. No matter how well done it is, it doesn't stand alone anymore.
Yes. And I will tell you that at one point in the late 60s, in a time in which I was, for whatever reasons, I'd taken LSD, and I was, which I didn't do frequently, but which I did, and it turned out badly. And I remember turning on The Tonight Show, which at that point, but hearing Ed laugh at what Johnny had to say somehow calmed me. And there's a certain kind of continuity, and there are times in which it's just good that people are there. And also there are times in which you're hot, and there are times in which you're perceived as old hat. And then all of a sudden somebody new, Chris Farley, who just joined the cast an hour and a half ago, was
did that Chippendales thing.
Did the Chippendales thing, which, yeah, well, you saw. And it was the same sparks as John, if you like. It was so funny and so funny in a new way. It will be compared to John because that's who he physically resembles. But it is just as funny, and when you find yourself laughing really loudly over things, or when John Lovitz did that line as Dukakis, that Jim Downey wrote of, I can't believe I'm losing to this guy in the debate with Bush. Those moments are just as pure, just as powerful, and to me, just as they make the job worth showing up for each week. And it is, it's very, very hard in television sometimes to think that what you do is worth doing or important. And there are lots of weeks in which it probably isn't. But I believe the show is still vital.
The talk show parodies have been very effective of late. Carvey did an unbelievable Regis Philbin in a Regis and Kathy Lee takeoff, and there was that long-standing thing on attitudes, which was deadly accurate and very funny.
Right.
But recently,
you mean you actually still watch the show?
Why, yes, I do.
Right, I see.
It's all research. It's all my whole life is research.
Yes.
You have to understand, Lorne. Recently, there was one where Carvey did Johnny Carson.
Yes.
And Hartman did the great Ed McMahon.
Yes.
And I'm sure a lot of people watching that said, this is kind of risky within NBC because they're pounding away at the #1 icon. What was the response within the building?
Entirely favorable. Everybody just really liked it, particularly on the West Coast. Couldn't have been happier.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Johnny himself sent a telegram and flowers, did he?
Mentioned it on the air. Yeah, no, they were thrilled because people like criticism, particularly when it doesn't come from within their own organization. And I think that it's the openness to criticism that has really kept the network alive and vital. And let's face it, this tradition only exists at NBC.
No, the other networks are really not tolerant of that, but it's a breath of fresh air that it exists here at NBC.
Well, if you look at the shows that broke ground in comedy, they're all on NBC, with the exception of the Smothers Brothers, which was canceled on the CBS at the point at which it broke ground and began to break ground. I think that Brandon Tartikoff would no more tell us what to do in our show, although he makes his opinions known, than he would tell Carson what to do or not to do on his show. The fact that that piece was rough on The Tonight Show, although we've done The Tonight Show, Dana and Phil have done Johnny and Ed 4 or 5 times, I think, before this. This one caused more reaction, but I don't think that it was, I'm not going to say that it was done with affection, although I think that Dana's Carson is not hostile.
Our thanks to Saturday Night Live's Lorne Michaels and to all of you for watching these 2 programs. Time to go. See you later.